Violence is how you got here. This self-annihilation, this thirst, this hunger for the sexual conquest, placed in neat little cubicles. The competition to meet some sort of perfect prepackaged representation of the cybernetic machine in all its supplication, the perfect soldier, if you will. But in looking past and craving this peace, which can never be achieved within the entropy production of the machine, that is, life comes from the chaos, to see this in a very simplistic way and to know this and to never forget it, and to even be come from somebody who may come from an atheistic or more science-minded family, even if they were to go and so supposedly embrace the conceptualization of a God, it would be the willingness to place themselves into the franchise or the franchisement of a cult, and to go through that ritualization to say that from an intellectual perspective, you realize that the Masons, the Eastern Stars, witches, druids, gods, and men, religious factions that held back to a central belief system, that the true meaning, the true message, the true code at the center is the fact that violence is how the entropy machine functions, and that we can sip coffee and pretend as long as we are feeding back into that entropy machine or that mechanism of willing imprisonment to get released on good behavior back into a larger prison networking system, right? That we are bound to it, that we don't exist outside of it. And this is an area that's really a very sensitive area, because you have people over and over again who say the moon landing never took place, that we aren't capable. There's no way we could have lost. NASA could have lost all that. There's no way they would have. It would have been kept under lock and key. It wouldn't have been just kept in some arbitrary old computer system that's outdated or fried. Or no, you've got a big cover up going on here, and this isn't about that. And then pushing forth this whole idea of aliens and alien contact, and Matthew Brown coming out with this bullshit about the Immaculate Constellation, and wanting to believe that there is in fact a God, and that we have to believe in God, otherwise we become self-immolation, we become self-annihilating robots, right? Where we realize that. So what's happening is that there's a violent bridge being created, and through violence, it's the only mechanism. When you look at spirituality, when you look at occultism, it's actually the artifact of, it's the same procedural process of this code of these zeros and ones going through a dance or an exchange effort of, well, once we put the human artifice together as a mechanism of representation and expression, through the song, through the colors, through the dance, through the balor, we have a communication system that goes beyond any sort of idiom or etymological assumption of a new language model that hasn't even been around for the last few hundred years and has changed so much morphologically. I mean, when we harken back to the borrowing of and the stealing off from ancient Greek, because Greek, it implied something much more arcane, that connected into these shapes and patterns in a living language, a living system, right? And that we couldn't speak life into one another or speak the truth because of the broad energy distribution of the entropy. That the enthalpy is quite real, but that Zerot's fourth proposed law absolutely isn't in play, because there is not another system that is erecting outside of this one. And if it is, then they want you to go off on this trail where interdimensionally the energy is going to another dimension, and it's being used to support a superior multi-dimensional thinking, from our perspective, omnipresent, omniscient, egalitarian community that can get along and can communicate through, telepathic mechanisms, and doesn't rely on the crude monkey like. But then when we look at the monkey, we realize that the monkey's smarter than the man, right? That the monkey is tapped into some sort of ontology of acceptance, to accept, to have no choice but to accept the violence, to move on every single day, which man cannot do, right? Man has to, through his violence. And when I say he, she is the representation. She is the entropy producing storm, the kicking up of this horrific, ugly frenzy. Yeah, this does sound a lot like Schopenhauer, but he was right on with this whole thing, right? Where you had to fight for these David Hume probity, like pure principles. And when we look at John Dee, I know I'm jumping around a lot, or Spinoza, right? Or even Blaise Pascal. When we, or Leibniz, right? Or Kierkegaard, right? We see that these great minds are grappling with this truth of, well, if God is an indoctrination, if God is implied, if God is even part of the sabotaging mechanism of the program that is hardwired into us, that we have to believe in some sort of fantasy or fallacy, and that fantasy or that fallacy, that Dio, that God figure has to be a violent figure, but it has to be like the violent father figure that he's only mean sometimes. He's only violently abusive at certain times. If you don't rile it, if you don't poke at the beehive, right? So you have this idea where people start to take on this sadistic behavior model, and they get places when they no longer bow toward creativity or education, or wanting to really piece apart the mechanisms of what makes the system work, and they leave, like Trump, they leave any idea of developing themselves from a literal sense, poetically, artistically, to have any talent, to be able to play a fucking simple song on the piano, right? You have someone who is completely and totally, utterly talentless, but violence is his talent, right? Violence is his talent. And for people who want to sing peace and kumbaya and act like violence isn't the very mechanism that gives life, well, you're taking it out in other ways. You're taking it out on yourself, right? When you look at this far left wokeism, which admittedly is what's really happening here. what you see is you see this far right despotic tyrant, right, of conservation, preservation, falsely representing the conservative aspects of preservation. Now, what's going to happen is it's like an ice age, right? Uh, you have this immense heat taking place that triggers off this ice age. Well, right now there is going to be a huge toxic feminist sweep in the coming years. It's culminating, and then it's going to fall back toward a technocratic taking over of this can never happen again. We can never have a tyrannical ruler or leader step in. The Constitution, as nice and as it was as a novelty at one time, no, we cannot let this take place. So you have a town will turn into a planet, will turn into a moon, will turn into an entirely different ecosystem where, and I believe that's what the moon is actually, where a satellite had to be erected, where those who Peter Thiel's representing this, like his whole thing on Antichrist. It's not the acknowledgement that God exists or that Jesus exists and therefore Antichrist exists. It's a statement of we had to become the monster. We had to create the story of a monster and become the monster and become the Antichrists because you all are that stupid. But the irony is that no one would exist without the entropy being distributed and redistributed. In other words, the massive boost in the last, if any of this is true and timelines aren't a complete and total lie also, is that the population has increased enormously, cleaving off the distribution of this entropy to which, in my opinion, that's the only thing that could be called consciousness. That there has to be an adjacency. In other words, say that you have this bus that runs on an electrical line, and that bus performs really well. I mean, that bus can maneuver and do all and stop and brake and accelerate, but it's tied in and it's fed to an undeniable system of energy. Well, if you were to make that energy something that you couldn't see visibly, that is what cybernetic control is all about, right? Is that you could only move so far at such a distance, and that the adjacency itself is what keeps you seemingly alive and keeps the idea of free will in play. And I kept forgetting that it's Sapolsky. For some reason, in the back of my mind, and I know that the two names just sound alike, but I also find it kind of ironic that when I think about Bukowski and the postman, through morbid mechanisms and morbid curiosities to see human beings and life in such a way. I mean, how horrifying each face must have looked to him as he was working behind that counter, right? And you could say that he was grappling with a sort of existentialist beauty, right? But that's not what was taking place there at all. And Sapolsky brings up some really good points, and I really do think that that free will doesn't exist at all, and that the idea of free will is by way of cleaving off. It's a violent taking over, or an assumption that you are somehow sit on this elite level, and you know that there's only so much pie. You don't know there's only so much energy, and through this adjacency, you'll stay just close enough to all the players in your family and your work, and secretly sift off this energy, and write your little book, write your little poems that allow you to stay within this little concentration bubble. But if you were to move away 100 miles, if you were to go into a different occupation, how can you say that free will exists when you don't exist at all? When you are an aphorism? Something to think about.